A left-leaning publication believes that the pandemic was hard for everyone except for landlords. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's coming out of a left-leaning publication, and obviously this publication is not a fan of landlords, and they're very much pro-tenant. They basically want to think, in their minds that all landlords are bad, all landlords are these rich, greedy people who are trying to screw tenants over, and we know that that's not true. We know that the truth of the matter is that a lot of landlords are just normal, regular people who are working full-time jobs, who are just might have one, maybe two properties, and they're just trying to get by. So when the eviction moratoriums and all of this mess started, guess what? They lost a ton of money. But apparently in this article, they believe that, hey, landlords came out good after the pandemic. Well, I'm going to read this and, I'm going to tell you exactly what my thoughts are. And you already know that I think it's a bunch of garbage, but, let's not even pretend that this is going to be something that's, unbiased. But before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know, did you come out good after the pandemic? Did your business boom and things become better? I mean, I personally think the majority of landlords didn't get a great deal, after the pandemic. They don't have more money. I think that the majority of landlords at best were able to maintain what they had before, and at worst, they lost a ton of money, okay? So, this article, it's coming from Vox.com, and it says, the pandemic was hard for everyone except maybe landlords. Yeah, good grief, okay? I can already tell where this is going just from the title, so let's get into it. Landlords, most of them at least, have been doing just fine during the pandemic. A new analysis by JP Chase finds that while landlords lost money early in the pandemic, they were able to cut expenses to the point that they had higher cash balances by June 2020 than when the pandemic began. In April and May 2020, landlords sustained a significant decline in revenue, rent payments, roughly 20% according to the research, but they were able to cut expenses by 25%. Then, by the summer of 2020, landlords were largely back to receiving normal rent payments. Let's dive into what this just said and, these statistics that were put out by JP Chase, because I think the people in this article are trying to mislead and give the impression that landlords are doing just fine after the pandemic when that's just not the case, okay? So one of the first things they say is that they had higher cash balances by June 2020 than when the pandemic began. So did they ever ask themselves, why did landlords have higher cash balances? So when the pandemic began and the eviction moratoriums began and we knew that all of a sudden tenants wouldn't be paying rent, guess what landlords started to do? They started cutting back spending immediately, okay? So they started cutting back, routine maintenance. They started cutting back capital expenditures. They started cutting costs as soon as possible so that if they did have a great number of tenants who weren't paying rent, they would have the cash reserves to at least be able to make their loan payments and not lose their properties. So that's why, in my opinion, a lot of landlords had an increasing cash balance when all of a sudden we're talking about a few months later. But then that's the second point that I really want to go over. Okay, they're talking about, well, by summer of 2020 landlords had bigger cash balances. I'm like, well, that was only a 3-month period from March, April, May, June. Okay, well, that's like a 4-month period. Okay, so in a 4-month period, landlords were doing just fine. Well, the eviction moratorium didn't end in June 2020. So in the short term, landlords were able to cut back maintenances and expenditures, right? And increase the cash balance they had on hand. But they weren't expecting for the eviction moratorium to last 18, 19 plus months, okay? They weren't expecting for this to just get dragged on and on and on. So why don't they do a better comparison? A better comparison would be how landlords, what their cash balances were after a year and a half of the eviction moratorium, not after 2 or 3 months of the eviction moratorium. That's extremely misleading, and this article and the people who are writing it know that that's misleading, okay? So, and then they said that by summer of 2020, landlords were largely back to receiving normal rent payments. So then the question becomes, which landlords are we talking about here, okay? So are we talking about the biggest landlords? Yeah, you know what? Guess what? The people who own, the hundreds or thousands of units, these huge apartment complexes, etc., they're the ones who suffered the least loss during the eviction moratorium. That has been proven already. The people who've been suffering the most during the eviction moratorium are the small mom and pop landlords who own 1, 2, maybe 3 properties, okay? They're the ones who, lost a ton of rent payments. I mean, I believe I heard that up to half of the mom and pop landlords had lost some rent during the pandemic. Okay, so it doesn't make sense that the things that this article is even trying to say, other than they're just trying to paint landlords in a very negative image. But let's continue. I'm going on a rant here, okay? This analysis pushes back against the narrative created by landlords that the eviction moratoriums were unbearable. Over the last year and a half, they have argued that tenants failing to pay their rent were creating a financial burden and that necessary costs to property ownership would continue leaving landlords holding the bag. What this study finds is that landlords largely had many avenues to cutting costs. Yeah, we have many avenues to cutting costs, but they're not good ones, okay? When we're talking about deferring maintenance, okay, a roof is bad, it's leaking, and we're like, well, rather than replace this roof, we're going to keep this cash on hand and let it continue to leak. And guess what? Now, there's even more damage because of that leaky roof 6 months down the line. But in the short term, we didn't have to spend that, $5,000 to replace that roof. Well, that's not good. And, like I said before, they're looking at the big landlords, and there are a lot of landlords that were suffering throughout this entire thing. That's why, they're saying that the narrative was that it was unbearable. Well, it was unbearable. We're talking about an unconstitutional law that was passed through that took away our property rights. And it took the Supreme Court to get rid of it. I mean, that's how completely ridiculous this law was. Just telling people, well, you don't have to pay rent anymore. I mean, that was completely ridiculous. Then not only did they tell these people they didn't have to pay rent anymore, then they started giving them money. Oh, here's some enhanced unemployment benefits. Here's 3 separate stimulus checks. Here's a child tax credit. Oh, and you don't have to pay rent. Then we'll throw rent assistance at your landlord too, and sometimes we'll just pay you the rent assistance directly. You know how ridiculous all of this sounds? If you were sitting on the outside, you'd be like, what is the incentive or the motivation for even tenants who aren't suffering financially to pay rent if they can't be evicted? I mean, there is none. So yeah, the people who wrote this article, they're being disingenuous, and I can't stand it. I mean, this is why I don't like reading these publications, because it gets me hot. Okay. The researchers write that since expenses fell more than rental revenues and rental revenues recovered more than expenses did in June, overall balances were higher during the pandemic. Expenses include things like deferring mortgage payments under widely available forbearance programs and putting off maintenance costs. To put some more numbers on it, in May 2020, landlord balances were 11% higher than what was observed in May 2019. In June 2020, landlord balances were 25 to 30% higher than in June 2019. And that trend persisted through May 2020, when revenues are down 3.6% and expenses are down 5.5%. So now they're saying because we deferred mortgage payments, because the landlords got forbearance, that, oh, look how good they're doing. They got forbearance. The bank wants their money, right? That after everything is said and done, after the forbearance period is over, the bank is going to be like, hey, where's our money? And if they don't get their money, they're going to take our properties. So give me a break. Talk about a joke. And the people who wrote this article obviously didn't talk to any landlords, didn't actually talk to anyone who knew anything about what was going on, because it's written idiotically, okay? Okay. Frustration aside, let's continue. This money in the bank might not stay there. Deferred mortgage payments will need to be paid at some point, and some maintenance is necessary and will likely be pursued. as things normalize in the next few years. Further, the JP Morgan Chase data suggests that, in particular, landlords in New York City, Miami, and San Francisco sustained harder losses due to declining rents in central cities over the course of the pandemic. But the analysis undermines the narrative about the plight of the small landlord during the course of the pandemic. Last November, I wrote about concerns that small landlords not receiving rental payments could undermine America's dwindling stock of affordable housing if they were pushed to sell or close down their properties after months of non-payment. No, the analysis does not undermine that narrative, okay? The analysis looked at like a 3-month period, not at the entire eviction moratorium. That information would be much more telling, okay? And it also, they mentioned right there that landlords in the biggest cities were suffering the worst. Well, there's a ton of small landlords in those big cities. So give me a break. I'm not even going to finish this article. I'm getting frustrated reading it, but just know that, simply put, this article is garbage, okay? Vox.com and these left-leaning publications, they want to do everything they can to try to make landlords look like the bad guys when all we want to do is just get paid the rental money that we are owed.